I'm going to take you into some things that kids said to their teachers. Things that kids said to their teachers. A 7-year-old said, "I thought I needed a hug, but I really need pancakes." Obviously, that resonates. A 5-year-old, she said it was a piece of cake, but there was no cake at all. She lied about the cake. That is not something to be proud of. A 6-year-old, you ready for this one? A 6-year-old, "I am moody when I need foodie." That will preach. No. Here's another 5-year-old. "Have you been to kindergarten because you're acting like you haven't?" Which, there's the things I learned in kindergarten. You've ever been through that list? Like share everything, play fair, don't hit people, put things back where you found them, clean up your own mess. Will Bond will be praying for all of us at this point. Don't take things that are not yours. Say you're sorry when you hurt people. Flush. Wash your hands before you eat. That also could probably be flush and wash your hands, right? Because people forget. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. They really are. Yeah. Kathy just gave an amen to me, right? Good. And I like this one. Take a nap every afternoon. How many of you in the take a nap every afternoon club? Yeah. I've told you before that if you come by my office, sometimes I go into deep REM prayer, okay? There's 2. Don't knock, just look in the window, pray for me. Last one, when you go out in the world, watch out for traffic, hold hands, and stick together. Might have been a Christian kindergarten. Kind of sounds like things Jesus would say, other than the flush part. But I want to take you into Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. That's where we're going to be today. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. The passage says, these are the words of Jesus, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." I'm just going to stick to this one verse. Obviously, there's a whole Sermon on the Mount. We'll touch on some other parts in a moment. I've always been amazed at, what is the Sermon on the Mount? It's like a 30-point sermon. I mean, he hits so many topics, but they all go together. They all feed into each other. And so Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." Why would Jesus use this metaphor to say that we're the salt of the earth? See, salt as we see it today is, it's great for cooking. Too much salt is in our foods. I mean, how often do we complain that you eat somewhere and there's way too much salt? You get home, if you're at a restaurant, you go home, you're drinking water all afternoon, right? Because you're like, wow, that was salty. We use salt to melt ice on roads, especially if you live up in the Pennsylvania, Ohio area. Those of you that are from the great north, you know all about that, how they prepare roads. And salt is cheap. You can go down to Harris Teeter or any other store and get a thing of salt, right? And it's not very expensive. But when Jesus made these comments, when Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth," salt was not cheap. The value of salt in Roman times was that it was extremely expensive, worth its weight in gold. It was hard to get. In Latin, it is the word sal. Roman soldiers were given an allowance to buy salt, a salarium. From that, we get the word salary. Many of you probably heard that, studied it. Yes, it flows down into our days too. By the way, I took Latin in high school. It was fabulous. I probably shared with some of you before. Got me through a lot of English vocabulary tests. Just kind of take the word apart and try and figure it out. Didn't mean I didn't study my English, okay, just so you know. Every once in a while there was a word I had to take apart. But the word salary coming from salarium, we get sayings like "worth his salt" from that. Along with this, in those days, and And actually, from the Roman times all the way to the mid-20th century, people used salt cellars. We don't see them very much. But it was many of them were extremely ornate for the wealthy, and usually only the wealthy could afford to have a salt cellar. It was something that they kept hidden, and if you were a guest of honor, they would bring out a salt cellar to the table so that you could use salt on your food. If you weren't a guest of honor, they didn't bring the salt cellar out because it was expensive. And so what kind of a guest are you going to share your salt with? That practice continued on until mid-20th century, because salt became very available around 1910, 1911. That's when they figured out how to mass produce or how to mass mine a lot of salt. So when you hear Jesus make this comment, do not read into this with our current understanding of salt. You have to go back and go, wow, wait a minute. When he says that you're the salt of the earth, he's saying you are worth your weight in gold to him and to this world, because you are the salt of the earth. We cannot live without salt. These facts don't actually get into the reason of the metaphor. I believe it's because you can't live without salt, and Jesus knew it. We would die without it. Of course, yes, if you go to the doctor, you've had too much, the doctor's going to say you've got to limit your salt intake because it's in everything. Frozen foods, tons of salt, right? You read canisters or cans, and you'll see how much salt's in it because it's a preservative. But what we don't usually think about is that we can't live without salt. We die without it. Salt is the key to the transmission of nerve signals throughout your body, including those that cause your heart to pump. Without salt, fatigue sets in. There was a university that decided to do a test. They had some volunteer students, I guess it was a group of guys, and they said, we want to test something with you. We're going to take you off all salt. There won't be any salt in your diet. We're going to feed you all salt-free foods. The first thing that went was their sense of taste. Food started to become bland. Next, they became fatigued. They didn't understand why. They just lost all energy. They also lost a desire to eat. They had to end the study because, according to scientists, blood cells will have problems and eventually coma will set in and death if you have no salt in your diet. So God is saying that the world needs us. Again, Jesus' perspective on salt. Don't look at our perspective, not in our times where there's too much salt. Look back at a time when salt was very difficult to get. It was very expensive because they knew. I've read studies on salt. I have a book on the history of salt in my library, and it gets into how, things develop. Populations could grow with the ability to get greater amounts of salt. For those of you who have an English background in your history of your family, your genetics, the English, once they learned how to salt fish and could get plenty of salt, they could then go out further into the seas to get more fish to feed the people. The Irish, on the other hand, it was just when they learned how to grow potatoes. Then, Ireland explodes the population. We all like that. But salt was so important. Again, God is saying that the world needs us. We are the salt of the earth. How are we to be the salt that Jesus wants us to be? Now we go back and we look at what Jesus was saying just before this. I want to take you into the Beatitudes. Matthew 5, verses 3 through 12. Jesus started out this sermon by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons or children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And as Jonathan was referring to just a moment ago, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So Jesus brings up these 8 characteristics, these items in the character of a person who is salt to this earth. whom Jesus will use as salt in the earth. First, again, poor in spirit. I look at that as being totally surrendered to God. You no longer live for what's good for your spirit. You live for what's best for God and for his kingdom. Those people will be given the kingdom. He then said, those who mourn, they will be comforted. But to mourn is those who, in a healthy way, can embrace sorrow, because sorrow is a part of life. It's one of the things I love, actually, about doing the Seder, is there's a moment when you have to eat the bitter herbs if you go to a Seder. It reminds you that there are portions of life that are very bitter, and that God is over all of this. He understands that we go through bitter times. The meek equal the humble. The humble. They will inherit the earth. Jesus said it, it's true. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled. That is not to be more righteous than everybody else. It's you want a right relationship with God, and you want to live a life that reflects that right relationship, that righteousness. Jesus is saying, you seek that, you will be filled. The merciful will be shown mercy. The pure in heart will see God. That one I'd really like to get to. I'd like to get to the point where my heart's pure. I think sometimes that's the reason why children see things with the Lord. Have you ever been around children and listened to some of the things? When I was pastoring my first EPC church, we got done with worship one day, and this couple came up with their daughter, and she sat through the worship service, and they said, our daughter was wondering if she could share something with you. I said, sure, what's up? And she said, I need to let you know that I saw an angel today in the worship service. It was actually while you were preaching, and he stood right behind you, and he had his hands over your head like this. I went, it felt like a really good sermon today. Was I surprised? No. And the parent said, well, what do you think? I said, tells me she probably has a very pure heart. She can see the things of God. God allowed her to see into the spiritual realm, to see something that was wonderful, that was pure. She saw an angelic being that day. Pure in heart. Peacemakers will be called the children of God. And finally, the persecuted. Great is their reward in heaven. I do think that in the throne room, it's just me, by the way, I actually think the martyrs probably get all the front seats. I could be wrong. I just have this feeling the martyrs for the faith, all those burned at the stake during the Reformation, all those who have been killed for their faith, following Jesus Christ. I mean, sometimes we don't take fully seriously the cost of following Jesus because we're so used to living in a land where we have freedom of speech and we can do what we want. We forget that during the Reformation, you could be killed for believing in salvation by grace through faith. Burned at the stake. Go read Fox's Book of Martyrs and read about what happened to those who went before us, the costs of the Reformation. Going all the way back to the time when the Romans were persecuting, there's that question of, was it good that Constantine, had a vision of the cross, under this sign you will conquer, and gave his life to Jesus Christ? You know what? That's kind of a 50-50 there. It's great because the emperor of Rome accepted Christ. Rome will become Christian. The persecutions will end. But on the bad side is everyone who had a public office, who wanted to keep their office, suddenly went, I'm a Christian too. Whether they were or not. Like I mentioned to you, last week when I showed you the picture of Istvan Boyder, and he was telling me that there's a bishop back under communism, back in the 80s under Ceausescu, there was a bishop over the Reformed Church. The bishop over the Reformed Church was not a Christian. It was a Communist Party position running the church. The persecuted. Great is the reward in heaven. So we have to infuse these things into our homes and into our living environment. Now, I was in seminary when the Spirit gave me kind of an epiphany about this. I don't know how many of you have had the same thing. You see, I used to read through that list. I'd be in Bible studies, or I'd go to hear speakers speak. They'd bring up the Beatitudes, what we call them. And I said, let's see, I wonder which one I am. And I'd hear some people go, I think I'm like the pure in heart. Another person saying, I think I've been through some hard stuff. I'm the one who mourns that I'll be comforted. And then you have that really difficult moment when the Spirit of God lets you realize that all of these are supposed to describe me. I don't get to pick one and go, I think that one's me. God's saying, no, all of these should describe you, Tom. All of them. It's like the fruit of the Spirit. It's a package deal. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. Do you know that comes from the Spirit? Yep. Ask the Spirit for it if you're dealing with that. But I had to go through this and go, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be poor in spirit. I should know how to embrace sorrow. I have to be humble. I have to hunger and thirst for righteousness. I have to be merciful to everyone around me. I have to be pure in heart. I have to be a peacemaker. And if I do all those things, I'll probably get persecuted. See, Jesus expects us to embrace these because think about the opposite. The opposite is selfish ambition, overly contented, self-important, judgmental, an agitator, and one who's willing to persecute others. That should never describe a Christian. But God, it's hard. And you know what it's like when holy anger fills your body and you're ready to just go let somebody have it? And God's saying, I will not have this. Let go. You know, one of my favorite scenes, one of my all-time favorite movies is Ben-Hur, Charlton Heston. One of my favorite scenes is right at the end when he's saying, when he was looking at Jesus and he could feel the sword drop from his hand, the sword to go after Rome with. You know, it's interesting when you think about how God works with us. Every once in a while I think through about Jesus' apostles. I mean, if you've ever read or heard of the book about Abraham Lincoln with Team of Rivals, Jesus has got like the ultimate group. Think about it. In his apostles, he has a zealot. You know what zealots think? Death to Rome. Rome's oppressing us. We have to go after them, and we have to go after them. And then he got a tax collector. I wonder, did they eat together? I mean, I wonder, you know, like when you see the Last Supper, did they picture them together, or do they sit at the other ends of the table, right? Each one going, that one's a nut. All that guy can talk about is he's going to follow Jesus till he can death to Rome, and at the other end of the table is, why in the world would Jesus ever let a tax collector on this group? And then a whole bunch of fishermen. I mean, Jesus, let's read resumes here, you know? Think about what you're doing. And he did. If these describe you, and I'm not pointing at anybody here, but this is for introspection. If these describe me, then I don't have Jesus' flavor of salt running through my system. And in the second half of that verse, it said, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by people. So take something as valuable as gold, it becomes worthless, and you throw it into the street. So what Jesus is giving is a warning to maintain our flavor as salt. Jesus does not give us a couple of warnings about how to live. Jesus does give warnings about how to live. Think about it. He says branches that get cut off that don't produce, they're good to be cut off, dried out, and thrown into the fire. He's not threatening he's going to throw you in the fire. That's not the point. He's saying stay attached to him. That's the point. Likewise, stay salty. Get very salty. Let people experience this salt from you, the humility and the meekness and the peacemaker in you. When you see two people not getting along, do you try to put it back together again and try to figure out what's wrong and how can we put this relationship back? What happened? How do you lose saltiness? You live life your way, not his. Many of you know that we just went through a time of sorrow and of mourning. We've lost people. We've had a few funerals, but one of the funerals I did, some of you heard about this back when I was on the West Coast, the family, Grandpa, he went by the name Pops because back when in World War II, he was a navigator on a bomber. He just happened to be, 23, so all the other members of the bomber group called him Pops because he was so old. But the number one thing in the middle of this ceremony, good thing it wasn't at my church, I would have said no, but we were in a funeral home, and the number one song I had to be prepared for was the granddaughter wanted to get up and sing Grandpa's favorite song at this funeral. Frank Sinatra's I Did It My Way. And I thought, how's that going to work for you? I didn't say anything. Believe me, I didn't get up and say, how dare you? I thought, no, we're not in my church. So if it had been, I would have said, maybe you're choosing another song. I don't want to hear I Did It My Way right in front of the living God. But this is part of how we lose saltiness. I know how I want to do it. So in application, see yourself as God's salt in life. Put the Beatitudes into practice. To do that, you have to study them, not just read them a couple of times or hear them in a sermon. You've got to go back and study those Beatitudes and go, what were you talking about, Jesus? Because Sermon on the Mount, that's his opening segment. That's what he leads with is the Beatitudes, his expectations of us, and then gets into the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. And yes, this can be very hard. I had a group of men that accepted Christ with me out on the West Coast. I did a Thursday night Bible study. And I took them into the book of Matthew. It was a group of about 8 or 10 men. They started studying this. This was a rough and tumble group, almost looks like Jesus' disciples. It was interesting. These guys weren't fishermen, but they were painters and carpet layers and all kinds of different backgrounds. One guy was an auto body. He would pound out auto body, the cars to fix them. And so I'm teaching them the Sermon on the Mount. And one of them looks at me and goes, this is really hard. Yeah, these are brand new Christians. And my answer to that, I said, well, don't worry. You'll look back a year from now and you'll see how the Holy Spirit has changed you. It won't be as hard. They go, no, they were just doing a complaint. This is just really hard though. Really? My line of work, do you know what this is like trying to do this? And I said, well, let's put it this way. You see, there was a couple of guys in the group who rode in rodeos. And so I asked those guys, I said, hey, I got a question for you guys. Would you ever go into a rodeo competition, whether it's roping a calf or it's going around the barrels on a horse that has not been broken? They go, no. Why not? You can get killed doing that. That thing could buck you off. It's a bronc. I go, exactly. And do you think that God will go into a time of ministry with a follower that he has not broken? Do you think God wants to have to yell at us? No. He wants to pull on the rein and we feel it. Right? He wants his wish to be our command. That we just pick up that he's going, hey, minister to this person. I go, okay, I'll do it. He puts somebody on your mind, I'll pray for him. Put somebody else on your mind, okay, Lord, I'll call them. He wants it just to be this sort of a lightness from him. He shouldn't have to grab me by the reins and go, back you go, Tommy. Let's do another direction. Instead, he wants to just be able to say, I need you to move this way. So if you've ever felt like, as you're following Jesus Christ, like, wow, why is the Spirit of God always having to bring up issues? And why does he have to change it? Because, yes, God's in the process of breaking us. What kind of person does God want to send into a ministry situation? Let's go back to the list. He would like to send someone in who is poor in spirit, who knows a healthy way that they can embrace sorrow, who's humble, who hungers and thirsts for righteousness, who is very merciful. Diane and I had a ministry director one time when we started ministry, and he made the point, he said, do you know who you'll confess your sins to? The person in your life that you know will be the most kind to you. That's who you will go and say, I'm having a hard time. I'm struggling with something. I gave in to sin. You won't go and tell someone who's going to rail on you, right? And go, what's wrong with you? Why did you do that? How dare you? Are you sure you're following? You aren't going to tell that person. You're going to go with the person who's going to be the most kind to you. The one who is merciful. He'll put somebody in who is pure in heart, who's a peacemaker, and who can endure forms of persecution. It doesn't mean we can always endure it. That's the Spirit of God has to do these things in us. Brothers and sisters, we're to be salt. And when people enter this house, they should be able to experience this kind of salt. And I think they do. When we go out into Virginia Beach and Chesapeake and Portsmouth and beyond, we should be this kind of salt. If God sets up a divine appointment with someone who needs help, he doesn't need someone who's going to rail on him. He needs us to be that kind of salt that they'll experience this pure in heart and this mercy and this kindness. The times I've ever preached on Sanctity of Human Life Sunday, I don't rail on people. I don't think you do either. It's because, why? Because there are people probably in this room who have experienced abortion. They don't need, if they've repented, they don't need it heaped on their heads again. They need to experience mercy from God. Because otherwise, if I think I get to heap judgment on them, I think Jesus is going to look at me and say, Tom, do you want to throw the first rock? Is that what you're signing up to do? You want to throw the first rock? And my answer is, oh, no, I'll just drop that. Hopefully that's my answer. Every once in a while I kind of go, yeah, but I got a good wind-up going, you know? I am ready to throw this baby. And it's a good heavy one. And God's going, really? Those without sin, throw the first rock. Go ahead. That's salt. Let it be something that enhances the flavor of the gospel.